The final days of the Third Reich were close at hand. On 23 April 1945, the Red Army was sweeping west to surround the blazing city of Berlin and was reported to have captured 11 Berlin suburbs. Dr. Goebbels on Hamburg radio told those listening, "The Führer has decided to remain in the Reich capital. He is in personal command of the defense against the Bolshevik mass onslaught. The Führer is directing the Battle of Berlin surrounded by military and political advisors. He himself makes the necessary decisions where his forces are to be used and where reinforcements must be deployed. All those who have seen him agree that he is full of vitality and has the will to master the situation. Despite the dire circumstances, he remains resolute, determined to fight to the very end." On 26 April, Berlin was encircled, and the following day the Soviets were nearing the capital of the city. On the 30th of April, Hitler was variously rumored to be dead, seriously ill, or seriously wounded. The Führer, if not dead, was about to die by his own hand. However, it was not until 1st of May that German radio broadcast this account of Adolf Hitler's death. Grand Admiral Dönitz, who succeeded Hitler as both Reich Chancellor and Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, in an address to the German people said, "German men and women soldiers of the Wehrmacht, our Führer Adolf Hitler has fallen. The German people bow in deepest mourning and veneration." It was not until the following day that the Russians announced that Hitler and Goebbels had committed suicide, and General Eisenhower was able to point out that Dönitz's statement that Hitler met a hero's death at his post is in contradiction with the facts given by Himmler and General Schulenburg. However, such details were of no consequence to Eamon De Valera, Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Neutral Era. Simply on the basis of what he had heard on the radio on the 2nd of May, De Valera, accompanied by T.P. Walsh, Secretary to the Department of External Affairs, called on the German minister in Dublin, Dr. Eduard Hempel, to express his condolences on the death of the German head of state. Frederick Boland, the Assistant Secretary at External Affairs, regarded De Valera's decision to pay the visit to the German legation in Northumberland Road as a ghastly mistake, and in his reminiscences recorded that it was the one thing he profoundly disagreed with him about. Walsh claimed that he and Boland had implored De Valera not to take the step he was proposing to make, literally on bended knees. "We asked him to remember all the Irish Americans who had lost their lives, but because he had been to the United States Embassy 2 weeks previously to condole on the death of Roosevelt, he was afraid of being accused of being partisan." Hempel, who was apparently pleased to be rid of Hitler, expressed concern at the interpretation which would be placed on De Valera's visit. De Valera was unconcerned and said, "I do what I think is right." Hempel told Boland afterwards that he was aghast at the De Valera visit. He didn't know what to say. Despite the adverse criticism to which De Valera's official expression of regret gave rise, De Valera declined to explain his action and gave specific instructions to the Department of External Affairs not to defend his gesture. Nevertheless, significantly, De Valera did offer a defense at length of his conduct in a private note to Robert Brennan, ERA's envoy to the United States, and a long-standing friend. "I have noted that my call on the German minister on the announcement of Hitler's death was played up to the utmost. I expected this. I could have had a diplomatic illness, but, as you know, I would scorn that sort of thing. As long as we retained our diplomatic relations with Germany, to have failed to call upon the German representative would have been an act of unpardonable discourtesy to the German nation and to Dr. Hempel himself." During the whole of the war, De Hempel's conduct was irreproachable. He was always friendly and invariably correct, in marked contrast with Grey, the United States minister in Dublin, whom De Valera heartily detested. I certainly was not going to add to his humiliation in the hour of defeat. Concern for Dr. Hempel's personal feelings suggests a decidedly perverse sense of priorities on De Valera's part. Professor Ryle Dwyer, an authority on both De Valera and ERA during the emergency, takes the view that De Valera wished to insult Grey and ruffle the feathers of the American eagle. At the time, this interpretation of De Valera's actions also occurred to Sir John Maffei, the United Kingdom representative in Eire. De Valera also sought to impress upon Brennan that the visit did not denote approval or disapproval of Hitler, and defended his action on grounds of logic and protocol. Objectively, De Valera seems to have gone far beyond the requirements of protocol. According to Reuters, in neutral Sweden, no condolences were presented to Germany on Hitler's death. In neutral Portugal, flags were flown at half-mast on public buildings, and this was regarded as perfectly adequate in meeting the requirements of protocol. The editorial of the New York Times of the 4th of May addressed the question of protocol. In making a personal call at the German legation in Dublin, it is possible that De Valera was merely following what he believed to be the protocol required of a neutral state. Considering the character and record of the man for whose death he was expressing grief, there is obviously something wrong with the protocol of neutrality, or with De Valera. De Valera's conduct was a source of considerable embarrassment to Irish Americans. One Irish American embarrassed by De Valera's gesture, officially undertaken on behalf of the Irish people, was T. Quill, president of the Transport Workers' Union of America. Writing in the Transport Bulletin, he comprehensively denounced De Valera's action. This is not only a crime committed behind the backs of the great Irish people in the homeland, but it is also an insult to the sons and daughters and friends of Ireland all over the world, who have never ceased to take their rightful place amongst the forces fighting for decency, freedom, and democracy. The Canadian press, like the United States press, was uniformly hostile. A memo prepared for the Canadian High Commissioner to Eire, John D. Kearney, revealed a spectrum of opinion ranging from Eire's conduct, representing neutrality gone mad, to bad taste on De Valera's part. It was Kearney's opinion that nothing which De Valera had done during the years which I have been in Dublin has evoked such widespread criticism, and much of it comes from persons who are normally supporters of his own party. The first British politician to allude to De Valera's conduct was Hugh Dalton, the president of the Board of Trade. His remarks were very low-key, a reflection of the fact that De Valera was very small beer compared to the momentous events which had taken place in Europe. Addressing the Paint Research Association in London on May 3rd, Dalton began his speech with the words, "If I was Mr. De Valera, thank God I am not, I would open my remarks by condoling with you on the passing of a painter." 6 days later, the press reported that in a written reply to a parliamentary question dealing with De Valera's call on Dr. Hempel and whether any protest had been conveyed to the Eire government, Emrys Evans, Under-Secretary for Dominion Affairs, indicated no protest had been lodged. Evans took the view that De Valera can be safely left to realize for himself the universal feeling of indignation which his action has aroused in this country and throughout the United Nations. The most significant and substantial response and reaction to De Valera came from Winston Churchill in the course of his victory broadcast on May 13th. Churchill viewed Eire's neutrality in a very unfavorable light. In 1938, he had been infuriated by the return of the Irish ports retained by the United Kingdom under the treaty. For Churchill, Eire's neutrality and the denial of the former treaty ports to the Allied cause, when the future of the civilized world was in the balance, was inexcusable and unforgivable. For almost 4 critical years, Grand Admiral Donitz's U-boats reaped a rich harvest of Allied shipping, 11.5 million tons in the North Atlantic alone. Churchill attributed the ease with which German U-boats could operate to Eire's neutrality. Furthermore, he believed that British and American sailors had died unnecessarily in the Battle of the Atlantic as a result of Irish ports being unavailable to the Allies. These views were by no means peculiar to Churchill. They find eloquent expression in Louis MacNeice's poem Neutrality, written during the London Blitz, and Nicholas Monserrat's novel The Cruel Sea. In his celebrated broadcast to the nation and the world beyond, Churchill alluded to Eire's shameful neutrality and acknowledged that but for Ulster's loyalty, which enabled the lifeline to be kept open in 1941, Britain would have been obliged to take action against Eire. The dawn of 1941 revealed us still in jeopardy. The hostile aircraft could fly across the approaches to our island, where 46 million people had to import half their daily bread from Brest to Norway in a single flight or back again, observing all the movements of our shipping in and out of the Clyde and the Mersey, and directing upon our convoys the large and increasing numbers of U-boats with which they bespotted the Atlantic, the survivors or successors of which are now being collected in British harbours. More or less, as Churchill spoke, dozens of German U-boats were being towed into Londonderry and tied up at Lisahalli, an iron tribute to Ulster's sterling contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic. The sense of envelopment, which might at any moment turn to strangulation, lay heavy upon us. We had only the northwestern approach between Ulster and Scotland through which to bring in the means of life and to send out the forces of war. Owing to the action of Mr. De Valera, so much at variance with the temper and instinct of thousands of Southern Irishmen who hastened to the battlefront to prove their ancient valour, the approaches which the Southern Irish ports and airfields could so easily have guarded were closed by the hostile aircraft and U-boats. This was indeed a deadly moment in our life, and if it had not been for the loyalty and friendship of Northern Ireland, we should have been forced to come to close quarters with Mr. De Valera or perish forever from the earth. However, with a restraint and poise to which I venture to say history will find few parallels, His Majesty's government never laid a violent hand upon them, though at times it would have been quite easy and quite natural. And we left the De Valera government to frolic with the German, and later with the Japanese representatives to their heart's content. When I think of those days, I think also of other episodes and personalities. I think of Commander Esmond, VC, Captain Fegan, VC, and other Irish heroes I could easily recite, and all bitterness by Britain for the Irish race dies in my heart. I can only pray that in years which I shall not see, the shame will not be forgotten, and the glories will endure, and that the peoples of the British Isles and of the British Commonwealth of Nations will walk together in mutual comprehension and forgiveness. Churchill's speech in content reflected his message to J.M. Andrews, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, in April 1943. But for the loyalty of Northern Ireland and its devotion to what has now become the cause of 30 governments or nations, we should have been confronted with slavery and death, and the light which now shines so strongly throughout the world would have been quenched. The Belfast Newsletter's editorial of the 4th of May deplored De Valera's visit to Dr. Hempel, ERA's official response to the death of Hitler, and mocked the idea of ERA having a seat at the peace conference at which ERA's irredentist territorial claim to Northern Ireland might be advanced. Accepting the Führer's death as a fact, its Prime Minister called on the German ministers in Dublin on Wednesday to express his sympathies, and was followed yesterday by the President's Secretary on a similar errand. This, of course, balanced the message of condolence which was sent to the United States on the occasion of President Roosevelt's passing. The demands of neutrality are satisfied, and a state which owes its escape from a German invasion to the armed forces of the Allies demonstrated its complete freedom from bias. Thus, too, is ERA's right to a seat at the peace conference justified, as well as her claim to possession of the Ulster bridgehead. Resisting all inducements to take sides in a war in which civilization itself is at stake, she sheds an official tear over the grave, if it were known, of the instigator of the conflict. Sir Basil Brooke, J.M. Andrews' successor, was pressed by a newsletter journalist for his comments and observations. No one, I feel sure, will expect me as an Ulsterman, as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and as a loyal subject of the King, to shed any tears over Hitler's death, much less to offer obsequious sympathy to any representative of the enemy. That kind of thing may be done in Dublin, but not in Belfast. Brooke offered a more extensive commentary on Ulster's contribution to the war effort in his broadcast to the people of Ulster on May 11th. It was Ulster's first Prime Minister, the late Sir James Craig, who said at the beginning of the war, "We are the King's men. We are with you to the end." In the stupendous struggle which came to an end in Europe 3 days ago, the people of Ulster knew where their allegiance lay. They have given practical expression to that allegiance far from home on fields of battle, at sea and in the air, as well as in the factories and shipyards. Brooke concluded his broadcast with words which would have found an echo across the civilized world. Now we rejoice in the victory of Allied arms and the total collapse of an empire that was to have lasted for 1,000 years. An empire doomed from its beginnings because it was founded on ideas that were a denial of truth and decency and all human values. Many citizens of Era were appalled by De Valera's condolences on the death of Hitler. Some, many even, had joined His Majesty's forces and served with distinction during the war, as Churchill acknowledged in his victory broadcast. Corporal O. Wynne, a Dubliner serving with No. 1 Production HQ, RAOC, BLA, wrote a letter to De Valera bitterly denouncing his visit to the German legation, which he described as Era's final disgrace in the eyes of the whole world, and an act which is little short of treason against all decent, freedom-loving Irishmen, Roman Catholic and Protestant. Wynne believed that the results which would flow from De Valera's action would not be inconsequential. By your unforgivable act, you have alienated any remaining sympathy or friendship for Era. We are now a nation exiled from the rest of the world. We can never again hope to be respected as a nation. Wynne concluded by venting his wrath on De Valera, "I hope you will live to regret your action. I hope you will live to see Era suffer for their faults. From today, I sincerely mourn for the nation into which I was born and lived. For me, Ireland has died. You have finally struck the mortal blow." On the whole, the world has proved to be rather more forgiving, but an audit of the cost of De Valera's action in the post-war world would constitute an interesting study. Thank you for watching this video brought to you by the British Unionist Society. Please help our work by sharing, commenting, and hitting the like and subscribe icons. And until next time, take care.